Welcome to the Decipher podcast. I'm Dennis Fisher, editor-in-chief of Decipher. With me today is my colleague, Lindsay O'Donnell Welch. We're here to talk about Operation Endgame, which happened today, and actually, I guess over the last 2 days, Lindsay. It was just announced today on Thursday. Huge takedown effort by Europol, a whole bunch of European law enforcement agencies, as well as a bunch of private security companies that collaborated in taking down, I would say, most of the well-known dropper and botnet infrastructure right now, at least everything that we kind of associate with most of the malware activity that goes on, things like IcedID, Trickbot, Smokeloader, Bumblebee. I'm forgetting a few, but it's one of the bigger efforts we've seen in, the last, I'd say 2 or 3 years. We've seen isolated takedowns of various malware and loader infrastructure, but this is the first big sort of umbrella takedown that I can recall in a long time.
Yeah, it's huge. I think they targeted like six or so different droppers. And having written about this malware, for, as long as I can remember, it's pretty exciting to see, a concerted effort really against all these different types of malware loaders that are used in campaigns, because these have been used really in the initial access stage of many email campaigns that we've seen over the past couple of years. And they've been used for various functionalities, whether that's downloading additional payloads or data theft, financial data, system takeover. But then more recently, they've been used to deploy ransomware, and that's really made them kind of a bigger threat, I think, as it relates to that ecosystem.
Yeah, initially a lot of these pieces of malware were used for things like credential harvesting, persistence, that sort of stuff. And then over time, they sort of became associated with ransomware families. Specifically, Trickbot was pretty closely tied in with things like Ryuk and other ransomware families. And Trickbot specifically has been around for God knows how long. I mean, long before the pandemic, we were just, looking up old stories we had written about Trickbot. There's dozens and dozens of them because it's been around for so long. And
Mhm.
there's also been several takedown efforts that have targeted Trickbot over the years. It's very centered on Russia, like the operators are allegedly are Russian nationals, and some of them have been added to the Europol's most wanted list after this last operation here. But those, I think the first takedown effort of Trickbot I remember was in 2020,
Mhm.
and that was a joint effort with Microsoft and some other security companies. And within 4 days, some of the infrastructure was back up. Obviously new infrastructure, but it was still operating again. And it was one of those like literal cat and mouse games, or everybody says whack-a-mole. It's the perfect description of that, because they take it down, it pops up in another form somewhere else. And we've seen that with ransomware groups over the last couple of years too. But this seems like a very well thought out and coordinated effort to address all of the infrastructure involved in all of these malware families. It's not just let's get this one C2 server, or let's go get this one guy, we know where he is. This was a bunch of arrests, I think 4 so far.
Yeah.
They searched dozens of locations. They took down 100 servers, 2,000 domains, I think.
Mhm.
So they're not messing around on this one. And there's some pretty ominous language in the video that they put out in their press release, which is like, this is just the beginning, which,
Yeah.
I just have this mental picture of guys like jamming, cash and things in the backpacks and like running out the door, trying to get out of there before Europol shows up at their doors.
Yeah, that would be a very chilling video to watch if I
Oh
was
God.
associated with one of those groups.
Yeah.
It is funny though, your point, because I was looking back at the Trickbot last takedown in 2020, and that had primarily targeted the C2 infrastructure,
Yeah.
whereas I think you're right. Like this one is just so much more broad. It has arrests, which to me is pretty big, because arrests like that, you're not only capturing the individuals or pinpointing them, but then also there's leeway there for potential like further identification or understanding of the cyber criminal ecosystem and potentially identifying others affiliated in that space.
Yep.
And then also, yeah, they also targeted the domains, they targeted the infrastructures, the servers, and they froze the illegal proceeds.
Right.
So I think there was a lot there. And that's something that I've seen that's kind of indicative of takedown efforts more recently, is trying to not just look specifically at the C2 infrastructure, because, like you said, that is kind of what had in the past led to that whack a mole type of
Right.
situation. But now really trying to be take a more holistic approach and like look at individuals, look at like the cryptocurrency funds, look at the different pieces that you can really make a whole, and try to better really stomp down on this ecosystem as a whole. So I think that was kind of a big piece of all this too, and it makes me a little more hopeful, I guess, than other
Yeah.
efforts in the past. So we'll see.
Yeah. The cryptocurrency part of it is always interesting to me because for, I don't know, 6 or 8 years or so after the rise of Bitcoin and some of the other cryptocurrencies, once they became associated with ransomware and other cyber crimes, there law enforcement and security researchers had a really hard time like trying to figure out what to do with that, like how to trace that kind of stuff. But now it really seems like in the last 2 to 3 years, law enforcement and some private companies have really figured that piece of it out. And so that's one of the main avenues they're using to sort of, um, you know, cut into these groups and figure out, okay, we know this wallet is associated with this cybercrime operation. Let's find out who controls that wallet or which people have access to that wallet. And then let's go from there, and sort of like, the NCIS board with the string all over it or whatever.
Mhm.
But they definitely seem to have figured that part of it out, which I think has made a big difference in these takedown efforts and the work to get after these cybercrime groups, especially internationally. The US is one thing, but a lot of this stuff obviously is based overseas where it's really difficult to get to folks, especially in Russia and in other countries like that. So I think that cryptocurrency tracing piece has been a huge win for law enforcement recently.
Yeah, I always love that part. It's just fascinating too to see kind of how that works at the back end in terms of how
Yeah.
these funds are, where they're going, how they what they've led to, and it also gives us a better insight into the cyber criminal malware ransomware ecosystem as well. Like I think in
Hmm.
this specific Europol release, they said one of the main suspects had earned, I think it was like at least 69 million in cryptocurrency by
Yeah.
renting out criminal infrastructure sites in order to deploy that ransomware. That to me shows that they're starting to really piece together all the different parts of this business that works, and having a better understanding of not just the picture there, but how we can like best tackle from a defense side that type of business really, and where we can go from there. So I thought that was a pretty interesting piece too as well.
Yeah. The money part of this is kind of staggering. $69 million is a ton of money,
Mhm.
especially when you're thinking about, like, in general, these things are not expensive to rent part of a botnet or buy an instance of some piece of malware infrastructure. The prices are relatively low, so that shows you the volume that they're doing, in how much of this is out there. I think there was another story this week about this 911 S5 botnet that was taken apart and some arrests were made, and that was like a different kind of thing. It was like this weird botnet that they would rent out, and cyber criminals would proxy their traffic through it to do all kinds of other stuff. So it wasn't the same as this, but same general family of nonsense. And they estimated that the guy that was running that had made almost $100 million in running that out in a much shorter amount of time than I would say Trickbot has existed. So it's kind of amazing how much money is out there for folks that are willing to step across the line.
Yeah, there's definitely money to be made. And one other just separate point that add some context, I think, to this takedown is just about the groups and the affiliates themselves.
Mhm.
It's so there's a lot of like overlap, I feel, and
Oh, yeah.
almost like it's almost like incestuous. Like for instance, like I know like the Trickbot threat group, or the operators behind Trickbot, had started broadening their distribution channels and were working with groups that were also affiliated with IcedID and some of these other ones.
Mhm.
So, when they're pointing out these different droppers, this is just like a tangle really of groups that are wrapped up in all of this. And um, I think going to lead to kind of a broad effort of people that are associated with all of this. So, and actually, they updated the EU's most wanted list with a couple of these different people from
Right.
all of these groups that range across the board. So, it's always good to see kind of put faces to the names and have just your faces out there now.
Yeah, that's not a list you want to be on. But
Yeah.
you're right. The overlap among these groups is kind of wild. It's just one sort of viper's nest of people that, you know, they have one idea and they do that for a while, and maybe that gets taken down, and then they come up with something else and they call the same guys or a couple of the same guys, and then they recruit some friends, and then it turns into, friend of a friend of a friend and that sort of thing. But yeah, and unfortunately, I do think, like, as well run as this takedown seems to have been, I, it wouldn't surprise me at all if in the next couple of weeks we see some more infrastructure pop up, associated with some of these malware families, because that's just, there's always somebody ready to take over, because
Mhm.
there's money to be made, as we just said.
Right. Yeah, I think, realistically that probably will
Yeah,
happen. But it still is nice to kind of see, that this is happening and it's rolling
absolutely.
out. And as they said, this is just the beginning. So
I know. That's the funny part. Like, for folks that haven't seen it, go watch the video. We'll drop it in the show notes, but it's very ominous, and it's kind of, and even just on the Operation Endgame website, they're like, this is the beginning. This is, I think they called it episode 1 of season 1, which is, it's an interesting format that they're using, or framework. But I'm interested to see where this goes from here. I would assume that they have other things that are probably either in motion or about to take place.
definitely. Yep. I would watch that show. So
Yeah, sure. It's gotta be better than CSI Cyber, that's for sure.
yep.
All right, cool. Well, thanks, Lindsay. Good to talk to you.
Awesome. Thanks.
See ya.